Hello, this is Dan Pro. I'm going to be doing another piston rig, and this is for a forum member at blenderartist.org who's having a few issues with his piston arm here. A few things. The forum member said he was comfortable with doing object and empty type rigging here, and you can actually see that all these meshes actually have some prior parenting scheme going on here, where these objects are all parented together. When we're doing parenting objects to an armature, we actually don't want any of these parenting relationships. So first thing I'm going to do is select all of these meshes here and do Alt P to clear parent and keep transformation. So what the keep transformation basically did was just allowed all these pieces to stay where they were prior to the parenting, or because of the parenting, I should say. So this is our base position. The next thing I want to do, you can see we've got all these rotation points here, and that's good when you're doing object to object or type of rigging. So if I rotate this piece here, it's actually going to rotate from this origin point, which would make sense, but when we're doing, like I said, when we're doing using armatures and bones, we actually don't want that. So what I'm going to do is select all those meshes and do Control A, and I'm going to apply the locations, rotations, and scale, and that will put one of those mesh objects, it'll change their origin right there. And if we look at our transform panel for any of these meshes, the locations, rotations will be 0, and scale values of 1, 1, and 1. Scale values of 1 mean unscaled in Blender. So now you might think that this is not very useful, because with that object origin before, you could actually rotate this where it was supposed to be rotated from, but we are going to add a bone there, and once this mesh is parented to that bone, it will actually take over this mesh's object origin. It'll rotate from the bone, not from the object origin, so it's not going to be a problem. And one thing that this does solve is if we were actually to move this, scale it, rotate it, and basically just move it out of position somehow accidentally, all we need to do is do Alt, G, R, and S, and it will go back to this default position, and that's actually very beneficial for rigging. Like I said, our bones are going to take over these rotation points for these mesh objects, so this is how I always like to work. Every one of my meshes has its object origin set at the center of the world. Another thing that's going to do is when we add our armature, so let's just do Shift A and add an armature single bone. And I'm going to undo that because I want to do Shift S, make sure my cursor is at the center of the world first, then Shift A, add armature single bone. The first bone in our armature is going to be the root bone, and every mesh object will have the same object origin as that root bone, and the object armature object itself. So it might not sound important, but it actually is. Now we can't see that armature in there. Let me see if I can select it back there. Get to our armature panel, and let's turn on X-ray so I can actually see the bone through our mesh, and we're going to turn on axis display. So here's actually what we're going to try to recreate here. This is these placeholder meshes are just kind of standing in for this main. We're going to rig this. One of the things that I ran into was you wanted this end piece to stay perpendicular with the ground here, and that's actually not physically possible because these two pistons are parallel to each other, and this is going to rotate in an arc. By not allowing one of these pistons to get an angle and to be able to rotate at an angle, it's just not going to allow that to happen. So this either needs to stay straight with both of these pieces, or some redesign needs to be done, or maybe even a cam at this lower piston spot. Maybe Quackmender can jump in here, and he's an engineer. He can figure that kind of stuff out. I'm not smart enough for that kind of thing, but anyways, we'll get in here and make most of this work, and I'll let the forum member kind of figure out all the particulars. So I'm going to actually go to hold Control and 3 on my numpad to go to left orthographic view, and we'll start setting up some of these bones here. I'm going to select this first bone. I'm in edit mode here, and if I don't say there's going to be a lot of tabbing back and forth between our mesh items and our armature objects and the bones and things like that. When I'm in edit mode, you'll see the bone is orange, and when I'm in pose mode, it will be blue. So you can see the pose mode down here. The main modes for armatures are object, edit, and pose. You almost never do anything in object mode after you add your armature to the scene. So you'll either see them blue or orange most of the time. Alright, so let's go to edit mode, and I'm going to take this first bone, RX -90, and I'm going to align this bone with the world. So you can see its y-axis is going with the world, the green, X and Z. Here's one odd thing about bones in Blender. Basically, a bone is just like an empty, only it has two vertices. Now, the important end of the bone is this end over here. That's the fat end of the octahedral bone. And if I go to pose mode here, and if I rotate it, you can see it's going to rotate from that head position. And all locations are actually being calculated from this head position. So I did Alt GRS by GY. It's the head position is right there. So anyways, that is the most important end of the bone. The tail end of the bone is also important for other things. Probably not going to be very much for the rig that we're going to set up right here. It's definitely good for extruding, or to do a type E to extrude. Alt G to make sure that that bone's not there. Alright, now this is the first bone in the rig, and we are going to it's aligned with the world. This will be our root. Now I'll explain this root bone when we're done and the importance of it, but for now, just be aware that it's one of the most important bones of the rig. So alright, now I'm going to actually use these mesh objects to set where all of my other bones are going to be. So I'm going to go to see-through mode here. I'm in edit mode of this lower base piece mesh. I'm going to type B. I'm going to box select these lower 4 vertices. Shift S, cursor to selected, and that puts that cursor right in the center of those 4 vertices. Now I'm going to tab back to edit mode of my armature. Shift A, and it's going to add a bone where the head will be right at that cursor point. So with this top selected, once again I'm going to do RX -90, and I'm going to align this bone with the world, and this will be our base bone. And one of the things we can do right off the bat is start thinking of how we're going to manipulate this bone in pose mode. So let's go to pose mode here, and this actually does not need to be a location controller, so we can lock that, and it doesn't need to rotate either, so we can lock all rotations, but it is going to move according to this base piece. It looks like, for me anyways, it looks like it's moving on these metal rods here. So it looks like X-axis is the way it's going to be manipulated, so we can lock everything but it was location actually. Let's unlock X location, and it isn't needed for scale. So now if I just type G, it will move on its X-axis only, so along with those rods that aren't present in this particular setup. But try to think ahead a little bit here. Now I can actually take this base, I'm going to select it, and then I'm going to shift select this bone, and you see this other bone is lit up. If that bothers you, just select the one we want to select, this base bone, select the mesh, then shift select that base bone again so the other ones aren't lit up. Do Control P, set parent to bone. So now that base piece will move only in its local X location with that bone. Alright. The next rotation piece we need, or the next bone we need, is for the center of this mesh here. So I'm going to tab into edit mode of that circle. Make sure everything is selected. Shift S, cursor to selected, and that will put that directly in the center of that mesh. Now I can go back to edit mode of my object, or my armature rather. Shift A, I'll add that bone right there. And with this top selected, GZ, I'm just going to drag this down a little bit. Now I'm going to go into wireframe mode so I can see these inner piston meshes we've got here. Now select one of these meshes. I'm going to tab into edit mode. Now I want to select these last 4 vertices, Shift S, cursor to selected, and now what I want to do is I want to add the tail of this bone at that direct Z value of this 3D cursor. So I'm going to look at the 3D cursor here, and hovering over the Z value, I'm going to do Control C to copy that value. Now let's go back into edit mode. I want to select this tip. So the tail position, the Z, I'm going to hover over that, do Control V to paste it, and now I know that this tail position is directly dead center of that mesh. So use the 3D cursor there to help me set that bone. Alright, now this is going to be our IK bone, and remember it rotates around the head of this bone, our XX. We can see our axes here. Now this is one odd thing about Blender. You can see the axes are actually displaying up here at the tail of the bone, but like I said earlier, it rotates from the head of the bone, so you have to sometimes use your imagination a little bit to especially when you're in edit mode. We can actually use the manipulators down here. You can see x-axis is down here, and z is here, and y is the length of the bone. Y will always be the length of a bone in between these 2 vertices. So, alright, so x-axis. What was I getting at here? Well, anyways, I'm going to, this is the first part of our IK chain we're going to set up. We actually parent this bone to our body bone. So holding or selecting this bone, then shift select our base, Control P, keep offset. And now I'm going to select just the tip here. I'm going to extrude it. Whoops. E to extrude, then GY. And I want this bone to go all the way to this pivot point right here. So I'm going to select this mesh, go to edit mode, make sure everything's selected. Shift S, cursor to selected. Now once again, back to edit mode. I'm going to select just this tip, Shift S, selection to cursor. So this will be our secondary IK bone here. Now in order to make this IK chain work, we just need our IK target. So I'm going to extrude that from here, E to extrude, then GY. Let's drag it out maybe about there. It's pretty arbitrary on this size. Now one thing that you need to keep in mind is right now, because I extruded it from this bone, this is a connected bone, but this is going to be our IK target. It cannot be parented to either one of these bones, which are going to be affected by our IK constraint. So I'm going to select this and parent it to our base bone. Control P, keep offset. Alright, very important with an IK constraint that your IK target is not parented to any bone that it's affecting. Alright, now this is our IK target, so we'll select that. Now we're in pose mode. I'm going to select the last bone of our IK chain, which would be this larger one here. That's going to be the bone that's going to get the IK constraint. Shift Control C. We will add constraints with targets, inverse kinematics, and basically what that did was just added that constraint to this bone with this as its target, so it just auto filled that in for us by doing it that way. So you can see it's bone 2, and what I need to do is actually change that name to IK target so it makes some sense. Let's actually call this MCH for mechanical bone, IK.001. And I'm going to do Control C while hovering over that name, and then Control V, select this next bone, and paste that. So now I've got those two bones named properly. These are going to be mechanism bones, so they don't need to be manipulated by our animators. And let's go back to our IK constraint once more, and you can see that it updated our bone name here. So we selected our target, shift selected that. That's how you add constraints without having to go in here and manually select your armature and select the bone and things like that. So, alright, IK constraint, we need a chain length of 2. So it's only affects this bone and this bone. Let's see what happens here. You can see that it's affecting both of those bones, but it's not looking like what we want. So IK constraints are a special constraint in Blender. Let's clear all our rig controls, make sure nothing's out of place here. And let's select this first bone here and go to our bone properties, and you can go down to inverse kinematics, and we've got special panel here for bones that are using the IK constraint. So because this has chain length of 2, it's going to do the IK on these 2 bones. Now this bone, we only want it to rotate around its x-axis. You can see it's that red axis, or that red arrow pointing that direction. That'll be the pin. Whenever rotations are always around the axis. So sometimes that's hard to understand when you're newer to Blender or any kind of 3D. Actually, is your rotations are always around a point. So x-axis would be like a pin. We only want it to rotate around there, so we're going to lock Y and Z. Now you can see what happens when we move this around. It's basically forcing it around only in that one direction. That is still not exactly what we want though, because this bone we actually want to lock completely. Alright, now what that's going to do when we move our IK target is it's not going to move at all. It's just going to force this secondary bone around in a circle only on its x-axis there. So, alright. Now one other thing I'm going to do in this constraints panel is with this larger bone here, the second bone, is I'm actually going to turn on the stretch for it. So now when I move this, it's going to stretch to compensate. And it doesn't matter how close or far away I get it, it'll stretch 100%. Now this is just because of a little odd thing we're going to run into here later. That's actually going to come up here in just a second here. Let's go back to edit mode. I'm going to select this large bone here and just type H to hide it, because I want to select the head of this IK target bone, and do E to extrude, and then GY, and I'm going to drag a bone back the other direction. Now I want to parent this to our IK target bone. Control P, keep offset. Let's go to pose mode, and I'll show you basically it's going to, wherever I move this is going to follow that because of the parenting. But what I want to have happen is I want this bone to actually track the tail, or rather the head of this IK bone. So that would be right here. It'd be the tail of this bone and the head of this bone. So what I'm going to do is select this MCH IK 002. That's going to be the target bone. This will be the bone that's going to get the constraint. Shift Control C. I am going to damp track to that, and now you can see what happens. It's always going to point directly at that bone. Now the reason I had that stretch, let me actually turn that off. There's actually, it just kind of, sometimes it'll give you an odd result here where it doesn't actually point directly at that at the head of that bone without this stretch on. So that's why I'm adding that. I'm not really sure why that's the case, but having this bone stretch is not going to be a problem, because we are going to parent both this rotating mesh and this upper arm to this bone, and not this one, because if we parented anything to this bone, it would actually deform it and stretch with that. So let's select this upper arm mesh, that circular mesh, and we'll parent that to that last bone. Control P, bone. Now let's move this around. You can see that that's going to, if I get out of wireframe here, that's going to move properly, and even though that bone is stretching, it's not going to affect anything. Now what we need to do is actually put this piston onto this piston bone. Let's actually name this here. It's IK target 001. It's actually piston. Alright, so let's select that mesh. Shift select the piston. Make sure that only that bone is selected. Why am I keep selecting that? This one. I gotta hide that bone. It's irritating me here. Alright. Set parent to bone. Now we've got our piston is working with our IK target. And you can see, because this is always damp tracking back, do Alt H, directly back to that point, it's going to keep that piston in line. Oops. Alt H. So there we go. Now our next step here is we can actually, let's just hide a few of these that are getting in our way. Let's parent this mesh and this circular mesh. So shift, select that circular mesh, and then this one. Let's parent it to this bone. Control P, set parent to bone. Now when we rotate that, if we just constrain it to an axis here, that is what we want. Do Alt H to unhide everything. Alright, now just a couple more bones here and we'll have a fully set rig. And I think I've been keeping up on my parenting and my naming here. Let's select this rotation point. Shift S, cursor to selected. And we'll add another bone. Shift A, RX90, and then GY. Actually, let's do GY the other direction. Because we only really need one bone here. This is actually going to be our lower piston bone. Piston 2. Let's parent that to our IK target. Control P, keep offset. And then one more bone here for this rotation point. Shift S, cursor to selected. Once again back in edit mode. Shift A, and then RX90, GY. Now I can actually go back to pose mode here and I can parent this mesh and this mesh to this one bone. Control P. I don't know what what I should call that end piece there. I'm just going to call it the pad. It looked like some type of pad on the end there. Probably completely off on that, but you have to forgive me for that. Now what I need to do with this bone here, because you can see it's going to rotate. Oops, I need to parent this one to that one too. So let's parent our pad bone to the IK. Control P. Oops. Control P, keep offset. Alright, now everything's working. Now I'm going to parent this lower piston to piston 2. Control P, bone, and I want to parent this mesh, circular mesh, to that one too. Now what I'm going to do with this one is, because it's pretty much lined up directly so it can point at the head of this first MCH IK bone, I'm just going to add a damp track just like I did with this one. So I'll select this one is going to be the target. This will be the one that's going to get the constraint. Shift Control C, we'll damp track it back. And now we have two pistons at work. But like I said earlier, because of physics and because these two are perpendicular to each other, this actually doesn't work. So either there needs to be some type of a cam here, or it needs to be redesigned so this mesh can actually rotate from a different point lower down here. But anyways, we've got most of this working here, and we can manipulate this one. Let's clear everything out. Now there's a few problems here. If we go to our side view, I can actually take this IK target bone and move that and break our mesh. So that doesn't look very good. So let's fix that up. We can actually do that by adding. Let's go to our constraints tab here. That's the bone with chain. Let's add a bone constraint to our IK target. Limit location. Now we're going to want the local space of that bone, and we're just going to limit the x-axis. You can see the pin right here. So whenever GX, we don't want it to move that way. So now it'll only go up and down, and then in Z, and in and out, and Y. And we can actually probably just limit Y 0. Let's actually, let me see, hide this bone here. It looks kind of distracting here. Pull it out. Let's look at our transforms. Looks like the Y 1.7. Let's do max 1.7, so we can't pull it all the way out. So we can't push it too far in, and we can't pull it all the way out. Now if we're tight up here and we rotate it, obviously we're going to have to be a little careful. Actually, we don't even have to rotate this in anything other than its local x-axis. So let's clear everything out here. One other thing we need to do is when you're using a limit location or limit rotation or a limit scale, you should always have this for transform checkbox here. So if I don't have that checked, even though we've limited this on X and I type GXX, look at this location up in our transform GXX. It's actually getting values even though it's not being manipulated. Now this is actually useful in some cases, especially for complex drivers or things like that. But in this case, we don't want that to happen. We'll just click for transform GXX, and now that transform isn't applied up here. So it's a little odd, but you should probably always check this for any limit type of constraint that you're adding. Alright, now we're nearly done here. One other thing, let's see, GX, we could probably limit this here too, but you can see because I parented this IK target to this body bone, when I move the body bone, and like we've only got it where we can move it on its local x-axis. Now this should work pretty much like, or at least from what I can tell of that image on it should work just like the image. No, anyways, now I talked about that rip bone earlier, and you might think that it's just an extraneous bone that's really not doing anything. No, because I locked the location here, you're probably thinking, well, if I just unlocked it, then I can move this wherever I want, and I don't need that rip bone. But here's where the rip bone comes into place. If I take that, type G, and then Shift Z, oops, do I have everything parented here? This is parented to that, Control P. Do I have the right one? Rip. Alright, everything's going to go with it. So let's grab that rip bone, type G, Shift Z, let's put it over in the corner here, type RZ, let's rotate it around. Now you can, everything in the rig is going to work relative to that rip bone. So that's the power of the rip bone here. You can see when I'm going GXX, it's the local axis, so I still can't, it's still going to work right over in this position. If I had to move this whole rig to a different part of the world, that's the power of the rip bone, and I can actually scale everything up, and everything's going to scale relative to that, and everything is going to work relative to that rip bone. So that is the power of the rip bone. It's probably the least used bone that you'll ever animate with, but it's also a very important bone, especially for character rigs and walk cycles and things like that. And making everything work where you can take your rig into any other file and scale it down or scale it up to whatever you need, and it's going to, everything will work. So very, very important bone. Now basically this rip bone, this base bone, this front bone here, and this IK target, let's do Alt H to hide them, and then we'll select all these other ones. All these other bones are actually mechanism bones that we don't have to manipulate. It's always good to take those and just move them to another layer, so we can just have the bones. Do Alt H, unhide them. Oops, this bone actually needs to be moved to that layer as well. Just have the bones that we need to manipulate our rigs with. So there you go, fat end of the bone. That's the important end. That doesn't need to be a location controller, so we should actually lock that. And it probably only needs to rotate on its x-axis. It probably can only rotate on its x-axis, so we'll change it to Euler. So we don't need quaternions if it's only going to rotate on one axis. That way it just makes it nicer if we just want to type in 30 degrees or something like that, rather than deal with the Euler. Weirdness. Anyways, don't be afraid of Eulers. Eulers are very good. Blender allows you to use them. I highly recommend that you learn how to use them, because they're most programs don't allow Euler or quaternion rotation. So I think I was saying Euler. Anyways, quaternion rotations, very useful. Don't be afraid of them. Learn how to use them. Anyways, it's going to make your rigging easier. It's going to make your animating easier because they just interpolate very nicely. But anyways, I won't get into that. So I hope this will solve your problem in your situation, and you see how the IK constraints and limit locations will work. and how bones fit together in nice parenting chains like this, and really simplify your rigs. So if you've got any questions, let me know. Good luck.